The day he found her, the land felt too still, as if the canyon itself were holding its breath. Silas Mercer had spent years avoiding surprises, yet the figure beyond his fence would change the quiet he'd built for himself. Some choices don't arrive with warning. They wait, silent, until you step close enough that turning back is no longer possible. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Silas Mercer rode slower than usual along the narrow path tracing the canyon rim, not because his horse needed rest, but because the dull ache in his leg had returned, a stubborn reminder of an old break that never healed clean. The sinking sun washed the ground in fading color, and Silas measured the remaining light the way he always did, calculating distance, time, and whether staying out this late had been a mistake. He hadn't intended to be gone so long. The eastern fence had sagged again, and resetting the posts had taken more effort than expected. He preferred the work alone, focused on the simple routine that defined his days. Keep the land secure, keep trouble far off, and come home unnoticed. Since leaving organized work behind, he'd learned that solitude wasn't loneliness. It was safety, and he guarded it with care. As the trail curved toward the wash, something interrupted the pattern of the terrain. Not movement, not sound, but an absence, a shape that didn't belong. Silas pulled the reins and the horse stopped instantly, trained to obey without hesitation. His first thought was practical and unwelcome. A body meant complications. The second was colder. If someone had followed him, he'd been careless. He dismounted and stood still, listening. No hoofbeats, no voices. Only wind sliding through dry grass and loose soil whispering downhill. His hand hovered near his revolver, not drawn but ready as he stepped forward, keeping the fading light at his back. Then he saw her clearly. A young Apache woman lay just inside the fence, arranged too deliberately to be accidental. One leg bent, the other stretched out. Her dress torn where it had snagged rather than been cut. One sandal missing, her bare foot dusty and scraped but not bleeding. Her face was composed in a way that unsettled him, not slack with unconsciousness, not tightened by pain, but calm, as if sleep had taken her by choice. A tightening spread through his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He crouched a few steps away, studying the rhythm of her breathing, steady, shallow, the pattern of exhaustion rather than injury. He searched for wounds and found none, which raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. His thoughts moved quickly, heavy with practicality. Leaving her meant exposure, cold, and the likelihood whoever had pushed her this far might return. Taking her inside meant risk, attention, responsibility he'd spent years avoiding. He didn't think about law or reputation, only that if he rode away, she wouldn't. Follow. He approached slowly, speaking once in a low voice to announce himself. She didn't stir. He checked her pulse, strong enough to last with rest and shelter. That settled it more firmly than any argument. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, adjusting his hold as her body shifted. Even in sleep her muscles held tension, as if she never fully surrendered to rest, and that sharpened his caution. He kept his gaze controlled, not lingering, and turned toward the cabin. The gate resisted slightly as he opened it, and he paused long enough to close it again, latching it by touch. Aware he'd crossed a line whether he admitted it or not, the cabin waited ahead, plain and shadowed against the fading light. Chosen because no one came there without intent. Carrying her across the yard, his mind brushed briefly against his past, years escorting wagon trains, people who trusted him and a failure that ended that life. He hadn't saved everyone then. He hadn't been quick enough. That weight had shaped every decision since, including this one. By the time he reached the door, night had settled fully. He shifted his stance, opened it with his shoulder, and stepped inside, already adjusting the space in his mind, already accepting the consequences of sheltering someone he didn't yet know. He didn't think of it as rescue, only as the one choice he could live with. She was alive. He was home. And whatever came next would meet the morning. He nudged the door shut with his heel and stood still while his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, listening the faint creak of cooling wood, the soft rattle of the stovepipe, the steady breath of the woman in his arms, confirming she hadn't drifted too far. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, spare, orderly, built for function rather than comfort. One table, 2 chairs, the iron stove cold, the narrow bed against the wall. He crossed the room carefully and laid her down, easing her onto the thin mattress, straightening her legs so the torn fabric wouldn't pull. When he withdrew his hands, her fingers curled slightly, as if registering the loss of support even in sleep. And that small detail lingered longer than he expected. Silas stepped back, instinctively creating distance, rolling his shoulders to release tension he hadn't noticed. He lit the lamp low, poured water into a tin cup, and placed it within her reach, positioning it so it wouldn't spill if she shifted. A second blanket he folded nearby without covering her, leaving that decision for when she woke. Only then did he truly look at her. Her dress was worn but carefully mended, stitching uneven yet deliberate. Her hands showed the marks of long travel, scraped palms. Dirt pressed into the lines, but no swelling, no fresh injury. He took it in the way he would inventory tools, attentive, controlled. The weight of the decision settled in his chest. Letting her rest here was no longer temporary. Once she woke, once words were spoken, the situation would become something that couldn't quietly be undone. He thought briefly of the nearest town and the questions they'd ask, then dismissed it. He'd chosen this land precisely so choices could remain his own. He took the chair by the wall, head resting on his knee, posture upright, patient as during long watches years ago. Sleep came lightly, broken by half-awareness, his senses tuned to any shift in the room. When she finally stirred, it was subtle, a change in breath, a slight movement, and he was fully awake before her eyes opened. She didn't startle. That surprised him. Her gaze traveled slowly across the beams, the lantern, the door, and finally him sitting several feet away. No panic, no rush to retreat, only quiet assessment, her body tense yet composed, as if waking somewhere unfamiliar had been expected. When she spoke, her English was careful, each word placed with effort. She asked first for fire, then salt, then gestured toward the door and requested a place to sit near it. Silas stood and fulfilled each request without comment, lighting the stove, setting a small dish of salt on the table, dragging a chair closer to the threshold so she could see outside. Her eyes followed his movements closely, measuring rather than doubting. He spoke only once, telling her she was safe for the night, an honest promise, though it felt smaller than the moment required. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging without fully accepting, and took the seat near the door, feet flat on the floor, posture alert. As the hours passed, neither forced conversation. Silas prepared a simple meal, set a bowl on the table without invitation. She approached only after he sat, ate slowly, stopping when satisfied rather than when it was gone. Nothing in her manner suggested helplessness. She was observing, conserving, deciding. Later, she spread her blanket near the doorway instead of returning to the bed. Silas watched without interference. Understanding comfort didn't always mean warmth. He banked the fire, dimmed the lamp, and returned to his chair. Thoughts heavier now, with the sense that her arrival had been more deliberate than it first appeared. And as night settled around the cabin, he accepted the truth he'd tried to ignore since finding her by the fence. This meeting hadn't been chance alone. She had come with intention, and by carrying her inside, he had already stepped into something that would ask more than shelter. Morning came softly, the pale light slipping through the window, as if careful not to disturb the fragile balance that had settled between them. Silas stepped outside to breathe the cool air, expecting the day to unfold like any other, yet sensing it would not. When he returned, she stood in the doorway, fully dressed, the repaired hem of her dress moving slightly in the breeze. Her gaze met his, steady and certain, and for the first time there was a quiet warmth in it. Not surrender, not dependence, choice. She spoke slowly, telling him in measured words that where she came from, crossing a threshold under another's protection was not accident, but intention, an old Apache way of binding paths. Silas listened without interruption, the meaning settling over him like the sunrise spreading across the land. He realized then that what he had taken for coincidence had been ritual, and what he feared as disruption had become direction. They stood together in the doorway, neither rushing the silence. The wind moved across the open land, carrying the scent of dust and distance, and Silas felt the tightness he'd carried for years ease in a way he hadn't thought possible. He didn't answer with promises. He simply stepped aside, leaving the door open beside him, and she chose to remain.